So the multi-site model is different in that it's got a longer term view because it resources the group that go through shared leadership, shared resources and shared vision.
When you made that sort of decision, this is what we're doing, this is the way forward, did you feel like it was well received by the church? Hello, welcome to another episode of Postcards from Antioch, a teaching and discipleship podcast from Barton Church. Now, it's me and Oz again, James and Oz today. Now, if you've watched this season from the beginning, you may have seen us in the first episode, and I believe I mentioned that that would be the only one that would just be me and Oz, because we've been inviting people from, particularly people from our local church from Barton, to take part.
But here we are again.
Yeah, we felt we had something that we thought it'd be good to do, so we decided to do it. So there you go.
That's it. Sometimes good, isn't it, when our plans get scuppered and we bring a fresh idea in.
Yeah.
So that's today.
Yeah. Well, as I said, we've been hearing voices from Barton Church this series, and as a church, we're reflecting on something that's happened in our community, in our congregation, and we've sort of reached a point, a good time, 7 years. It's kind of like we reached 7 series in the podcast. It's 7 years that Barton Church has been a multi-site church with 2 congregations in Canterbury and Faversham. And we thought, as a part of that whole reflection, it would be good to have a bit of a history, I suppose, a bit of the story of the multi-site and so on, for either for our own members or just other church communities want to hear how we've sort of approached the issue of how to expand as a church.
Yeah, and I think that's helpful, isn't it? Because quite a few people have joined the church in the last 7 years and weren't a part of the early conversations.
That's right, absolutely.
And don't know the story in its fullness, or even maybe need to hear some of it for the first time.
Exactly, yes. Yeah, and that's a really good point. So before we begin, though, an important question for you, Oz.
Okay.
If you had, because it's been 7 years, and this is series 7, and this is probably going to be episode 7 of the season. If you could have 7 of something, what would you have?
Oh wow, 7 of something.
Yeah,
interesting. That's quite difficult.
Yeah,
I'm going to have to come up with something funny, original, and also revealing about my personality.
Exactly. I thought this will stump him.
This will stump me. I would have 7 opportunities to achieve something that I really want to achieve.
Okay.
Because I might fail the first 6 times and therefore need the 7th.
That's quite a good answer, really, considering I put you on the spot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't said what I'd like to achieve. But the thinking behind that is sometimes it takes a few goes to accomplish something that's worth trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
So why not have 7 goes and then go, actually, if I failed on the 7th time, leave it there.
Okay. Well, bearing that in mind, obviously, as a church, we embarked on quite a major project. Didn't take us 7 tries.
Thankfully not.
Yes. But we're going back, so it's been 7 years since we've been in multi-site, but sort of the discussions happened before 8 years ago or maybe. So, Oz, what's the thinking? Was Barton getting too big? And like many churches do, they face the decision of, well, what do we do? Do we move to a bigger venue? Do we plant a church or what? What was the prompting?
What was the So I joined Barton in 2012, and it was a great learning opportunity for me, working with a team of elders and many mature leaders in the church. It was fantastic. A smaller staff team than we've got now, but really experiencing how God was bringing new people to the church in that phase of Barton's history. So from about 2012 to 2015, I was settling in, and we were always talking about mission. And as an eldership team, one thing that I loved was that it wasn't just about maintaining church. It was about seeing church growth. Obviously, not just numerical, also in maturity and in depth. So one of the questions that we were asking regularly what was the best, or would be the best growth strategy? And I think because we'd experienced some numerical growth and we wanted to continue to see that happening, because it's a sign of God's kind of blessing and bringing fruit and conversions and maturity, new people joining the church, was to have a clear vision. So in 2015, we wrote a 5-year vision document, which was sort of branded as a 2020 vision. Quite a few churches and organisations did it. You must have come across that sort of thing.
Yeah, 2020 is a good year to have, isn't it? Really?
Exactly. What's your vision like,
Yeah, exactly. 2020 vision, very good.
So most of the church rolled their eyes. Here we go. The elders have got a vision, and a part of that vision was this phrase multisite, because in our preparation, we began to think, actually, the multisite model of growing a church seems to be best suited to our context, our passion, our interest, and the history of Barton. That's where it began. And then from 2015 to about 2017, we really dug into that as a leadership team. We had away days, we talked about it, we researched about it, we read about it, and we began to talk about that as a possibility with the church members. Okay. So and some of the feedback was, well, why don't we just do multi-service? Add another service to Barton. But being a church that hires a venue, that was always going to be a bit of a stretch and a challenge. And more than that, we thought, well, but what if we could do it somewhere else? Then we've got a missional new geographical area, as well as running 2 services. We're in 2 locations. So there's a bit of an advantage there, but it's quite an unusual model for church growth in the UK.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, what is the difference between multi-site and, say, church planting? Which obviously when I was at college, when I was studying, it was church planting was the kind of... There we had training. That's what the training, not mine, but that's what training was offered in church planting. That is a means of...
And I think really multi-site is one approach to planting a church. The extreme church plant is you raise up a team from within, you send them off, you almost wave them off and say, see you at Christmas. Yeah. It's that kind of approach where you prepare, you resource, and then they have to go for it. Yeah. And Barton had done that in the past, some sort of, I think, 15, 20 years earlier. And that had been okay, but it had been quite hard for resourcing and for some within the congregation. Yeah. And so the question was asked, we're just doing that again. That was quite tough. Is that the best model? So the multi-site model is different in that it's got a longer term view, because it resources the group that go and others that gradually join through shared leadership, shared resources, and shared vision. Yeah. So you're not starting a church as an independent church. Yeah. You're basically having a congregation in a new place, and it would normally be 15, 20 minutes away, drive at least. So there's a reason geographically, and you're reaching a new area of the town or the city or the county, whatever it may be. So that's what's different. And then typically there's loads of different models with how that works. Yeah. Some, the goal is independence after 3 years. Yeah. So you get to become, you're essentially a type of church plant, you're then independent. For others, independence isn't even on the agenda. It's just, we're going to operate like this with 2 sites and benefit from one another. And as a leadership, we didn't want to commit to a time frame for Canterbury and Faversham to become a multi-site church, with Faversham and Canterbury being independent, but instead that we would launch it and just track it and see how it went, that model.
So that was something that the elders and you and Eric talked about and planned in conversation with the congregation over the... How do you feel that when you made that sort of decision, this is what we're doing, this is the way forward, did you feel like it was well received by the church?
I think change is always hard for churches and for individuals, and you get the early adopters, maybe 20%, 10 or 20% keen, enthusiastic, love that idea, on board, and then maybe 15 or 20% that are going to challenge it. And typically what's left, 60%? Ish in the middle that will need a bit of influencing and can be shaped by the either end of the extreme. And we definitely experienced that. There were some that felt, this was exciting, this was good, and others that were a bit more resistant. And that's okay. We needed time to lead the church in that direction and to discern from God that it was not just a good operational decision used with our rational mind, but also one that was spirit-led, confirmed through the word, through the body of believers. So we didn't want to just say, here's our vision and the strategy that we think is best. We wanted to go, actually, we feel like this is God-given, is God's timing, and we've got to do something practically about the numbers in Canterbury, which were sort of 250 to 300 quite regularly. And we knew that if we continued to see numerical growth, that we'd fill the space.
Yeah.
But also the other thing that can happen with a congregation when it gets that kind of size is people can get complacent and a bit disconnected because it gets too big.
Yeah.
So they were some of the factors that we would talk about, and we ran forums and monthly prayer meetings and wrote letters and had consultation. And gradually the church got on board and agreed, let's go for this. But one of the sticking points was when to go for it.
Right.
Because how do you know when you're ready?
Yeah.
It's difficult, isn't it? And I think one of the things that struck me when I was weighing this up was it's about being prepared, because you're never going to be ready.
Absolutely, yeah. There's never going to be a perfect time, or very rarely is there.
You're not going to have 20 leaders just prepared and ready to go at the click of your fingers, or £30,000 in the bank ahead of schedule. These things don't normally happen, and we have to apply faith. And so one of the hardest things was for those that kind of disagreed with the decision and felt that it was actually unwise. It wasn't good stewardship of resources, people, or finances. But then the other end of the spectrum where, no, we've got to take a step of faith. We're the mission's out there. Let's get on with this. And we arrived at having taken the church through probably a 9-month period of meetings, prayer, explanations, FAQ responses, all those things, to then launching in the second Sunday of September 2017. So probably 9 months of proper preparation, and off the back of probably 18 months of leadership level discussions, prayer, reflections.
So quite a lengthy process. But I think, from at that point, I was, I don't know, was I working for the church then? Maybe I was in the congregation. I don't think I was.
I think it was 2 years before you joined staff.
So
a year and a half.
I don't remember it being like, sometimes I've been part of churches and you can sense, something's wrong or people are unhappy. And I don't remember that. Like, my experience as a member of the congregation was that those discussions were taking place and people were asking questions. I think Barton's like that anyway. It's quite a church that's quite good at. There are people who, if they've got questions, they'll say it, and you get the kind of good challenges. But at the same time, I think it was done in a really healthy way, I think.
And I think a few things helped that, which kind of happened rather than was clearly a part of the strategy from the start. We sought out a few other churches that had done it. So we spoke with the Forge Church in Suffolk. We had a connection there, and travelled across and spent a morning with some of their elders and staff, because they run 3 sites across one church, multi-site model. And it was really good to hear the different dynamics, the pressures, the way staffing is managed, pastoral care is managed. And then we also spoke with the City Church in Canterbury, as they operated as a multi-site model, 2 sites within Canterbury and 1 in Whitstable. They're now no longer a multi-site because the Whitstable plant or site is independent, and Canterbury just has 1 congregation. But at the time, they shared many really helpful things, and then we ended up on a training course, a group of us elders and staff, which again, so we kind of got experienced people to speak into it. And then that was kind of coupled with a bit of a Macedonian call, which I think helped people go, God's in this. So we had a number of families coming from the West Faversham area and Faversham generally to Canterbury. And that's partly why we thought Faversham would be the right location for the new site, knowing that Canterbury would change as well. But the new thing was going to be a Faversham thing. But also there was a group of Christians from various churches running a messy church once a month in the West Faversham Community Centre. They called it Active Church. So we started by just going and helping with what God was already doing in that area of town. And then we started a life group, a midweek small group. And so we were kind of there midweek or once a month before we were there on a Sunday.
Yeah.
And the leader, Reverend Tracy, was very warm in her welcome and said, come and join my team. I'd love to help this move into a weekly church presence, and come and join me in this mission, was kind of the message. So we were reflecting and had been reflecting through the book of Acts and on chapter 13, and how the church in Antioch sent out Paul and Barnabas, and the Holy Spirit really sent them through the prayers and fasting and the church body. But we felt this is time for us to send some, and to do that through the active church at first, once a month, and then a life group, and then culminating in the actual Sunday afternoon service.
Sounds, from listening to you, sounds like that was a just a good idea, to, rather than say, right, we're going to location X Sunday, the whatever, bang, let's start. That you kind of had people already there, people already involved first, and did that.
And I think the other big factor was one of our elders, Tim Jenkins, and his wife Liz, felt really called to demonstrate leadership through being an example, and actually putting the house on the market in Canterbury, and then through some quite interesting circumstances, and you could say God-led opportunity, buying a property in Faversham, and saying, look, we're committing to this at a leadership level, and who else is going to come and join us? And I think that developed a core team with a few other families, some that were in Faversham, others that were Herne Bay or Canterbury based, going, I'm going to be a part of this, and maybe I'll consider moving as well. So we had a few people moving, and others joining the start of the site.
So in the early days, did that happen? Did you get a lot of people? Did we get a lot of people going across to Faversham and just seeing, is this where I need to be on Sundays? Did that happen?
Yeah, and our approach was a soft approach rather than a hard approach, which would have been a team of 20 or 30, off you go, everyone else is behind you in prayer but staying. So instead we went for a soft approach, which was, okay, those that feel already, great. That was about 15 adults. But actually we'll have a phase, maybe 6 months, a year, where those in Canterbury that aren't sure yet can go and try it out. Go along in the afternoon, support, serve, help. And maybe at the end of 6 months to a year, God will have spoken to you about which site you should engage with. And we were kind of saying, it's not just about committing to Faversham, pray about whether you should commit to Canterbury. So this is a multi-site model for both locations.
That's right.
Bringing change, not just it's all happening in Faversham, which inevitably was the tendency and still is, because that's where the new thing has happened. But there was change at both congregations.
So you mentioned in passing that the service in Faversham was in the afternoon. That was because it kind of picked up from the active church.
Exactly.
Where that left off, wasn't it? But was that also, obviously as a staff member, I'm involved in both sites as a preacher. And it does create that opportunity to share members of staff across both sides.
That was one of the huge advantages. Not only were we had weekly hire space at 4 p.m. We tried looking at a space in the mornings, couldn't find one, couldn't get one. But actually, again, providentially, essentially, it meant a band could go up and both play in Canterbury and then also in Faversham, or a preacher could preach in Canterbury and then also Faversham, and people could do both on a Sunday. And they might be tired at the end of the day, but were also able to bless one another, and that. The aim was for that to be two-directional rather than just one-directional, even though through the early years it was primarily Canterbury team supporting and helping Faversham team.
But the goal was always to sort of raise up people in Faversham. So it wasn't supposed to be an indefinite period of staff doing twice as much work.
Exactly. I think on one hand, we felt that the staff would serve both sides, but that doesn't mean being present at each every Sunday.
Every Sunday, and
doing
everything,
many
every
volunteers.
service,
We had the benefit of, I think, 4 or 5 bands when we started. So if you were serving in Canterbury and Faversham, you'd have 4 weeks before you did it again. But then that changes with people moving away, some members of the band playing in a few bands, and suddenly we found one of the challenges was the unsustainability of the model. And if you're working Monday to Friday and a Sunday's a full day, it's a busy week.
Yes, absolutely. And that sort of preempts my other question, which was I was going to ask, in those early days in particular, what were the biggest challenges? Now, you've already mentioned one of kind of resourcing 2 sites. Were there any other specific challenges?
Yeah, I think initially it was quite easy and natural to tell stories of what was happening in Faversham with the Canterbury congregation and benefiting both ways from what God was doing. But past the first year, that became harder because people kind of became settled and had done that initial push of getting the thing going. And then it was, how do we do this on an ongoing sense? And inevitably 2 congregations develop their own identity, their own age balance, relationships, community. So we had to fight harder to understand one another. And, church is people, not the building or the time or the venue. So gradually over the 7 years, we've found community really thriving, growing in Faversham, which is great. But many of those congregation members don't know or haven't been regularly to Canterbury. And similarly for the newer people in Canterbury, understanding what's going on in Faversham. So I think that's become one of the big things, how we demonstrate we're one church. And we did do a few things to look at that, which I can mention later. But one of the other issues was how there was a loss for those that moved to Faversham in their relationships in Canterbury. There seemed less that was lost and sacrificed as such in Canterbury. But for those that moved away to a smaller community, leaving the area and the relationships that they were very close to, there was a feeling of change that was hard, actually. As well as mission is exciting, this is change, this is God-led, actually doesn't come without an element of sacrifice. And that, I think, was hard for some.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also, just as a multi-site model and as a church, as we experience today, it becomes not just twice as much work in communication and complexity, but more than that, because you have to think a lot more about how we communicate centrally, what communicates and happens at each site because of who the people are leading and talking. And so I think the organizational challenges really ramped up, and how we both keep the vision the same at both sites, but also give freedom for expression that was genuine,
unique, spin on it, because both congregations are very different, do have a very different feel, not just in size, but in terms of who's there and the way the services are carried out and structured and so on.
That's it.
Yeah.
And one of the reflections of that was more staff lived and were primarily at the Canterbury site.
Yes.
And we didn't at the time have any staff living and based, therefore, in the Faversham site, which was good in that we had local leaders in Faversham that were stepping up and really, throwing their lot in. And certainly Tim and Liz as elder's wife, and the Prices and the Halls and others from the start. But it did mean that communication was more of a challenge, and how to support the longer term growth of both sites became more of a headache. And we increased Ross's hours when we went multi-site, and we employed Nicole, who was our kids worker, as a ministry trainee. We gave her some hours, and they both were sort of physically present, but not. And then when Nicole moved to Faversham, we had a bit of a game changer. It was suddenly, now we've got a voice into the heart of the Faversham community at a staff leadership level, which really helped. Yeah,
that is a big plus, I think, for for doing this kind of model. Having, if you want to be one church, you need voices from all the sites feeding into that sort of one church.
And that's it, elders, staff, member leaders, life group leaders. And that's the model we've tried to work towards. And we're in a healthier place now because we have 2 staff members based in Faversham.
Yep.
And we're trying to grow the eldership. But as I oversee both and live in Canterbury area, my time is more Canterbury than Faversham, and yet that's probably reflective of the size of the congregation. So, okay.
Yes, that's right.
So there's been those kind of surrounding challenges. I think one other challenge that I'd highlight would be that in Canterbury, we have this building here where we're in now, 32 Barton Road, which is a really good base for community midweek mission and discipleship. And in Faversham, we're feeling after a couple of years that we had become known in the town as a church that met on a Sunday. We had developed relationships with the other churches that were increasingly positive, but we weren't really present midweek, bar a Wednesday, Thursday night life group. And so what does midweek mission look like beyond live it out in your front lines and your communities, which is the main way. But in Canterbury, we had toddler groups and community cafes.
Yeah, we've got resources essentially in terms of a physical location and things. Yeah.
So I think that was something that we grappled with. We thought about: do we hire premises? Do we, find some funds, raise some funds, and buy something? And it's just a big commitment. So we felt that we needed to make Faversham a bit more of an established congregation before we went into purchasing something. And let's start with adding some staff members and growing the eldership, and let's see what mission develops from that, rather than building creates mission. Let's do the mission without the building and see what we can do.
Yeah. So again, my experience, yes, you are remembering now that for those first couple of years, I was just a member of the congregation. But from my perspective, it seemed to be going well. And it felt like a very positive thing.
Yeah,
I think it was, just as you said, it was hard for people who had friends and to leave friends and so on. But so, what were some of the big positive, the big
definitely
wins?
We should talk about that. I think one of the great wins was space for people to grow in their leadership. We had a Multisite transition team that bridged the birth of both sites and the first 6 months. And then we transitioned it into a site leadership team in Faversham and Canterbury. It struggled in Canterbury because of the systems and structures we'd had in place. But in Faversham, it was excellent. A good team of people that were growing in leadership and available during the week. And that was good. So I think that, and the space for people to join teams, everyone was involved in something. You couldn't be a passenger in that congregation in Faversham. And that was wonderful. And so I think, people were growing quite rapidly in their faith and serving in their gifts. And from the start, mission was in the DNA of the congregation. So we were talking about outreach and evangelism and how to connect locally. It wasn't always easy to actually change that heart and DNA into action, but that was always on the agenda. It was at the heart of conversation. And I think the joy was seeing community grow through shared life midweek. Even though Sundays was the main gathering point, midweek people were growing in all sorts of discipling relationships. And people really found belonging. And then probably the other good thing that happened was we began an inter-church youth work on a midweek Wednesday night called Hope Faversham Youth. And I think that was a year or year and a half into us starting the congregation in Faversham. And that really blossomed quite early on and was a great demonstration of blessing the other churches in the town with Ross, our employed youth worker, and some of our youth, because we had quite a few youth. And doing it with others. So it was a really good sign of, this is why we're here. We're making an impact, a difference to families and young people and the next generation.
Yeah. And it felt to me that because I've been in situations where a new church moves into a town and the way they go about it is really important, because it can send mixed messages to the other Christian communities. I feel like in Faversham, that's been a positive thing.
Yeah.
Like,
I think it warmed up quite quickly, thankfully. At first, it was a bit funny, but they were so welcoming and relationally, the leaders we've always had really good relationships, and that led to regular prayer mornings on a Saturday that built the community, and joint marketplace carols and all sorts of good events that, they were very, that was good. And I think in Canterbury, just to not forget the joys and the challenges in Canterbury. Yeah. So that was talked mainly about Faversham, but actually what was harder in Canterbury was it felt like some of our heart had been taken out of us. Yeah. And that what was left was we were more stretched. We didn't quickly replace the numbers and the quality of mission-minded leaders that went to Faversham. And so we had to figure out a new identity. And actually some of the glue within the congregation had gone. And so we were feeling our way for a few years. So even though we remained a reasonable size numerically, we were riding a few waves of trials through that season with leadership change, with some of the key people moving to Faversham, with other people moving away. And then COVID hit.
Yes, COVID. I was going to mention that because that did impact, not just churches across the country and the world, but everything. But in terms of what we did at Barton, how did we cope with COVID as a multi-site? Yeah,
well, again, because we were in hired spaces, we couldn't really choose when to return to Sunday gatherings. So many other churches that had differing hiring arrangements or their own building regathered, after 3 or 4 months. It took us 14 months. So that was 14 months of doing church online. Yeah. And actually, I think we grew in a new way as a church.
Definitely. Things like Postcards from Antioch, I would say, were a direct result of what we had to do during COVID.
Yeah. So bringing on a few people like Wes to help us with our tech, and a few other staff positions. You had been in role for probably 2 years. Yeah. Alice Caulfield, our pastoral coordinator, had come on board just 6 months before COVID, if that, 4 or 5 months. And that seemed timely, and God's kind of, look, here you go, here's someone just for when you need it. And so actually what we found in COVID was, whilst we couldn't gather in community, we'd had enough of a Faversham congregation and sense of closeness. And we almost rediscovered what it looked like to be church beyond Sundays, to engage in local neighbourhood and community care in action, to gather online via YouTube or Zoom and make the best of a difficult time. And we saw great things happening, people coming to faith in that season or exploring faith. We saw some people moving away, as many did in that season, but church grew through the trial that we all encountered. And we came out of COVID, certainly in Faversham, as a closer community. I think in Canterbury it was harder because there were more fringe, a wider level, and we initially went to 2 locations. Barham.
I was going to mention that because in a sense, at one point we were running 3 sites. Yeah.
We got funny with our terminology then. We're like, it's not a proper site. We'll call it a location, but essentially it was like a 3rd site.
It was essentially, It functioned the same way, kind of in terms of sharing the resources. And so on.
And so for 3 or 4 months, we were kind of jumping between Canterbury, Barham and Faversham on a given Sunday.
Yeah. I remember we had to juggle the preaching team around.
We did.
Yeah. That was the first time where, because again, that was the first time where people were having different preachers, really.
Yes, it was.
With the same passage. Typically, up to that point, we'd been able to keep the same preacher preaching on both sides.
Exactly. But again, what happened, we were almost forced into this, but it was a good thing. We grew the preaching team.
Yeah, absolutely.
We grew service leading teams across both Faversham, Canterbury and Barham. We grew bands in those locations. And everybody had to be a bit more stand on your own feet. And we kind of went from a church in a van to church in cars at Barham and Faversham. And Canterbury was sort of resourcing both with extra staffing support. But it made us rethink the model. And for a time it was good until we felt actually Barham leadership were being stretched. Families were kind of coming back to Canterbury for the youth work because there were the numbers for youth ministry in Barham. And then actually from that point, month on month, we rebuilt some momentum in Canterbury, and sort of probably for the last 3 years have really sort of grown term by term numerically and as a community, which has been amazing.
So after COVID, then really that kind of forms the period from, I would say, post-COVID to where we are now. Feels like, because we came back to meeting together at Canterbury. We picked up a lot of new people. Some of us had found us online during COVID. Others had moved into the area, and I don't know, I suppose it's probably not, but it felt like me for the first time we had maybe more people in Canterbury who had no idea of Faversham, no contact with Faversham. And that sort of is quite a big shift in terms of the thinking in the church, really.
It'd be really interesting to figure out what percentage were around when we started Faversham or became a multi-site church, and I think it wouldn't be that high a percentage. No. So a lot of new people, a lot of people moved away geographically, right. Other churches. Change happened throughout COVID, didn't it? And at the end of COVID. So really now we're in this phase of review. We've been going 7 years. Barton Church has been going for 67 years, and Canterbury and Faversham as sites for 7 years. So it's a good number to go, let's review. And we did a proper review a year into being multi-site and tweaked a few things. But now, having both found our feet confidently post-COVID, this is a really important year, I think, for the next phase of the story. Like, what does it look like to continue being a multi-site church? Well, sustainably, to grow in maturity, in outreach and mission. What needs are there in leadership, in membership, in storytelling across sites? And probably one of the best things that we've done over the last 2 or 3 years has been our joint services. Where we've gathered together at Barton-under-Blean purposefully, halfway in between both locations, 4 times a year, Christmas, Easter, twice in the summer. And we've celebrated the festivals and we've celebrated baptisms. And they've been such an encouragement to the smaller congregation that is Faversham, and a reminder to Canterbury, look, it's not just about Canterbury. And we've sought to use preachers and musicians and leaders from both sites speaking into those services to help. And
from my, as sort of one of the preaching team and responsible with you in some way for the rota and so on, this, again, we've reached a point where we've almost come full circle in the sense that we're now, the preaching team is not so much, it's divided into sort of people who are based in Canterbury, people who are based in Faversham, but it feels to me very much like a Barton preaching team, because before it was kind of, well, you're based in Canterbury, so you preach in Canterbury, you're based in Faversham, you preach in Faversham. But increasingly we've had sort of preachers travelling between sites, and before it was just you and I really who were known at both sites. But and that's been quite intentional. I mean, it's partly been practical, like availability, but it's been quite intentional to have certain people, like elders and so on, at both sites. Yeah, I think that's been good, and it's another way of reminding the newer people, particularly, we're one church. And whilst the aim isn't to know everyone in the congregation in Canterbury and Faversham, it is to understand we're a part of something bigger. That God is at work where we are in Faversham and in Canterbury, and because the vision is always seeing God transform lives, communities and culture, it's great to hear about 2 communities within a short distance where that's happening, as well as the individual being baptized, and preachers can share something of their story, and service leaders and others that we interview. So over the next few months, we've got a couple of people from Canterbury sharing in Faversham about what God's doing in global mission in their lives. And it might be that someone from Faversham comes and shares about what they're doing in their life. So there's a benefit to being a part of something more than just the immediate. Absolutely. Yeah. And it's, again, the purpose of this review is not sort of, we're having a crisis of of faith as a church, thinking, is this working? I think there's no doubt that it's worked. And at the moment, this, very much feel that God is calling us to continue this model. So what is the purpose of the review from sort of your perspective?
Yeah, I think the purpose is to acknowledge with the membership where things aren't quite working as well as they could, and to go, we want to do something about that. We want to bring glory to God more through the way we operate, the way we communicate, the way we lead. And also then when we do make decisions and bring change, there's been a process of involvement that the membership have had with the leadership. So we need to do that together. It started in a place of togetherness, and the unity of the church is key.
Yeah.
And if we had a vision for independence between the two, then we should go through the process to that. If we've got a vision for carrying on as we are, but with some clear distinctions that are going to be helpful in how we operate and do mission, then let's be clear about that. And that's kind of where we're at. And I think God's kind of, through different people, helped us to see we need to move a bit away from some of our language of sites and independence and or dependency and of the operations, and a bit more to the familial language of the New Testament. The church is a family with brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
And maybe we could use the analogies we have of Barton Church being the parent and having two daughters, two sisters. That are different ages. Canterbury's older, Faversham's younger. And those sisters have got different personalities with different career directions and interests, but they gather for key moments in the year. And the goal is to see both as independent adults on one level, but not independent to the extent that they're not connected and relating and supporting one another through the ups and downs of life. So I think how we help the Faversham younger sister become a bit more self-sufficient and a bit more encouraged to go and do contextual evangelism that's different to Canterbury, that's great. And similarly for Canterbury, what does it look like if we continued to grow and be that a third site, be that a different service time, a new opportunity. So thinking about the future really is what we want to do through this review. Look at the past, where have we come, how are we doing, and look ahead. What model for strategic church growth have we got? And if we're convinced Multisite is the best way to do that, great. But we're not committed to Multisite, a method. We're committed to the mission and the message, which is the gospel and the mission that God gives us in his word.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Oz, is there anything else that you think it would be important to mention?
I think maybe we'll just end with two things. Firstly, really this happened because we felt off the back of prayer and reflection on mission, what is God saying for the future? And as I read earlier from Acts 13, the Spirit sent Paul and Barnabas through the body of believers, the leaders that were praying, the church that were praying through prayer and fasting. And let's not get complacent and comfortable with where we're at. For Canterbury and Faversham, we need to carry on being a church that is sent out on mission by his Spirit into our daily workplaces, but also collectively, and thinking about the need of wider East Kent and the other areas. Praying that we'd carry on having mission as the central thing, not Multisite, but the mission of God. And then the other would be, if any of our members that are listening from Canterbury or Faversham, do send in any questions, thoughts. If you want to hear more of the story, I could go into a bit more detail, but you might be done with that. But you may think, actually, it'd be really great if this could be a part of our plans for the future. And in this period of review, we're going to be bringing more thoughts and details as a leadership to the members in January, where we can hopefully chart the course or plot the course for the coming years. And we want people's involvement in that. And then, we're excited to see how God continues to build his church.
Thank you, Oz. Well, that's some insight into how God's worked in Barton over the years, and how we as a church have looked at addressing some issues or some of the challenges that it means to be a church. And maybe some of you in your own churches, you're facing similar questions about where to go next. And hopefully this has been helpful to give you some insight to maybe things that you think, well, that sounds good, or that wouldn't work for us, or anything like that. And as I was said, for members of Barton, we're going through the review process. So please do comment if you would like to, if you haven't already. And Oz and the elders are very much wanting feedback at this time. But that's that for this episode of Postcards from Antioch. And thank you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.